Tonight, before we begin, picture a horse and rider moving very slowly across an enormous flat prairie, somewhere in the middle of America, a little more than 170 years ago. It is late in the afternoon, and the light is low and golden, and the grass runs away from the road in every direction until it simply becomes the sky. The rider is a strange figure to look at, even from a distance. He is immensely tall, so tall that his boots hang far below the horse's belly, and his trousers have ridden up to show 6 inches of shin, and he sits all folded up in the saddle like a carpenter's rule that will not quite close. He wears a rusty black coat with sleeves that stop short of his wrists, and on his head is a tall black stovepipe hat that has seen better decades, and inside that hat, tucked against the crown, are letters and notes and legal papers, and half of everything the man needs to remember, because the hat is his office and his filing cabinet and his desk, all in one. The horse is not in any hurry, and neither is the man. There is nothing out here to hurry for. The next town is hours away across the grass, a little courthouse village where tomorrow there will be cases to argue, small quarrels about hogs and fences and debts of $9, and the man will stand up in a plain wooden room and argue them, one by one, in a high, reedy voice that people somehow never forget. But that is tomorrow. Tonight there is only the prairie, and the creak of the saddle, and the wind moving through the grass in long, slow waves, the way wind moves across water. And here is the strange thing, the thing the farmers notice when this rider passes their gates at dusk. He is talking to himself. Not muttering, not complaining, but telling himself stories, working through old jokes, turning sentences over and over the way another man might turn a coin in his pocket, and every so often he throws back his head and laughs, alone, out loud, at something no one else can hear, and the sound rolls away over the empty grass and is gone. And then, a mile later, the laughter has drained away entirely, and his deep grey eyes are fixed on nothing at all, and his face has fallen into a sadness so complete, so still, so bottomless, that strangers who see it sometimes stop and ask if he is unwell. He is not unwell. He is only thinking. No one on earth, not even the man himself, knows yet what he is thinking his way toward. He is a country lawyer with patched trousers and a borrowed horse blanket, a man who owns almost nothing, who was born in a dirt-floored cabin about as far from power as an American could be born, who has failed in business and lost elections and buried people he loved beyond all telling. And in a handful of years, this folded-up figure on the slow horse will carry the whole weight of a breaking nation on those bony shoulders, and he will hold it together when nobody on earth believed it could be held, and the words he writes with a steel pen by lamplight will still be spoken aloud, from memory, by schoolchildren, 2 centuries after the prairie wind has forgotten him. That is where we are going tonight, into the long, strange, sorrowful, and quietly magnificent life of the man in the tall hat, from the very beginning of it to the very end, and even a little way past the end. But not yet. There is no hurry at all, no hurry whatsoever, and there is nowhere else either one of us has to be. So settle in now, wherever you are, and let this be the moment the day finally ends. Let the bed take the whole weight of you, every last pound of it, and let your hands lie open, and let your jaw go loose, and let your shoulders come down from around your ears 1 slow inch at a time, and then 1 more inch after that. If the light beside you is still on, let it grow dim, or let it go out altogether, and let the screen fade and stay faded, because you do not need to watch anything tonight. There is nothing to watch. There is only a voice, and a story, and the dark, and that is all there needs to be. You do not have to follow every word of this. You truly do not. You do not have to remember the names, or the dates, or the order of things, because none of it will be on the test, for there is no test, there is only rest. The words are here to keep you company on the way down into sleep, the way a fire in the next room keeps a house company, and if you drift off long before we ever reach the log cabin, or the flatboat, or the tall hat full of letters, that is not a failure. That is the whole point. The story will still be here tomorrow night, patient and unhurried, exactly where you left it, and it will wait for you the way the prairie waits for the rider, without any complaint at all. Before we sink all the way down into the 1800s together, just two small things, and then I will not ask anything of you again for the rest of the night. If these long, quiet lives told slowly in the dark are helping you sleep, you might leave a like or subscribe for the nights to come, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. Only then. And if you feel like it, before your eyes close for good, leave your town and your local time down in the comments. Just a few words, nothing more. Because it helps other sleepless people find their way to this little lamplit corner of the internet. And because there is something gently comforting, I think, in knowing that right now. In hundreds of towns you will never visit, in time zones scattered all the way around the turning earth, other tired people are lying in their own quiet dark, listening to this same slow voice, drifting down toward the same soft sleep. All right. That is everything. The door is closed now, the lamp is low, and the night is long, and we have a whole life to walk through together, slowly, gently, one quiet year at a time. Let us begin, as all the best long stories begin, not with the man himself, but a little while before him, back before there was a tall hat, back before there was even a name, back in the deep green woods of Kentucky, where the story of this family, like the story of the country it would one day save, starts with people walking west into the trees, carrying everything they owned on their backs, looking for a piece of ground to call their own. Because to understand the man on the slow horse, you have to understand the world that made him, and it was a world of woods and rivers and axes and mud, a world lit by firelight and candle stubs, a world where nearly everyone was poor and nearly everything was hard, and where a boy with no shoes and no schooling and no prospects of any kind could still somehow in the long run of years become the most consequential American who ever lived. The country he was born into was itself barely older than a grown man. When he arrived, squalling on a corn husk mattress in the dead of winter, the United States had existed for only about 30 years. There were men still alive who had marched with General Washington, old men now, dozing by their fires, wearing their faded uniforms on the 4th of July. The ink on the Constitution was scarcely dry, historically speaking, and the great experiment it described, the idea that ordinary people could govern themselves without kings, was still exactly that, an experiment. One that most of the crowned heads of Europe confidently expected to fail. The nation hugged the eastern edge of the continent, a strip of farms and seaports, and everything beyond the mountains was frontier, enormous, dark, and only half mapped. Into that frontier, for 2 generations before our story starts, the restless families had been pouring, down the wagon roads and through the mountain gaps, and among those families, drifting west from Virginia in the 1780s, was a farmer who carried the same name our rider on the prairie would carry, his grandfather, the first Abraham. And it is with that grandfather, on a warm planting day in the Kentucky woods, that the family story truly opens, with an event so sudden and so sorrowful that it bent the fortunes of everyone who came after, the way a single stone high on a mountainside can bend the course of a whole stream below. We will come to it in a moment, slowly, the way we come to everything tonight. There is no hurry. Breathe in once, slow and easy, and let it go even slower, and feel how the room holds you, and let the prairie and the rider fade for now, because the light is changing, the years are rolling backward, and the great green quiet of the old Kentucky forest is rising up around us, tree by tree by tree, until the sky itself is only a rumour far above the branches. In the 1780s, Kentucky was not yet a state. It was the far western county of Virginia, a land of canebrakes and buffalo traces and forests so old and so dense that travellers said a squirrel could cross the whole country without ever touching the ground. The soil, where you could clear it, was famously rich, and the stories of that soil travelled back east along the wagon roads like a kind of music, and men who owned thin, worn-out farms in Virginia heard the music and could not sit still, One of those men was Abraham Lincoln the Elder, the grandfather of the president, a farmer of some modest substance who sold his Virginia land, gathered his wife Bathsheba and his 5 children, and walked them all through the Cumberland Gap into the western woods to begin again. He claimed good land, built a cabin, girdled trees, planted corn, and for a few years the gamble seemed to be paying, the way gambles sometimes do just before they turn. And then came the morning in 1786, in the middle of spring planting, when the whole family story cracked in half. The frontier in those years was a contested and bleeding ground, fought over by settlers pushing in and by native peoples defending the hunting country that had been theirs beyond all memory, and the violence ran in both directions, raid and reprisal, year after sorrowful year, and it fell on the just and the unjust alike. That morning the elder Abraham was in his field with his 3 sons, Mordecai, Josiah, and little Thomas, who was about 8 years old, when a shot came out of the tree line, and the father fell where he stood among the new corn. Josiah ran for the fort, Mordecai, the eldest, ran for the cabin and the rifle, and Thomas, 8 years old, simply stood there in the field beside his fallen father, too small to understand and too frightened to move, while a warrior came out of the trees toward him. Inside the cabin, Mordecai rested the long rifle in a gap between the logs, aimed at a silver ornament on the man's chest, and fired, and the man fell, and the boy Thomas was gathered up alive, and the field went quiet, and nothing in that family was ever the same again. Under the law of Virginia in those days, the law of the eldest son, nearly everything the father owned passed to Mordecai alone, which meant that Thomas, the youngest boy, standing in that field, had lost in a single morning not only his father, but his entire inheritance, every acre and every shilling of it, and would begin his life over from nothing. He became a wandering labourer, hiring out with his hands, a boy of the roads and the woodpiles, and though he grew into a sturdy, honest, well-liked man, a carpenter and farmer with a gift for a story and a joke, he carried out of that childhood no schooling to speak of, and no capital but his own 2 arms. His famous son would say, many years later, with that dry Illinois understatement of his, that Thomas grew up literally without education, and that he never did more in the way of writing than to bunglingly sign his own name. Remember Thomas, this orphaned, wandering, unlettered boy, because the way the world had knocked him flat and offered him no hand up would shape, in the next generation, a son who never stopped believing that every person deserves a fair chance, and a fair race, and an unfenced road up and out. By his late 20s, Thomas Lincoln had steadied himself. He worked hard, kept his word, bought a little land in Hardin County, Kentucky, and in 1806 he married a quiet, dark-haired young woman named Nancy Hanks, who had herself been raised in other people's houses, poor even by the forgiving standards of the frontier. Those who remembered Nancy in later years spoke of her the way you speak of candlelight, softly and at a little distance. They said she was thin and gentle and intelligent beyond her station, that she could recite long passages of scripture from memory, though she could barely write, that there was some settled sadness in her that never quite lifted. Thomas and Nancy set up housekeeping in the town of Elizabethtown, where Thomas worked as a carpenter, and in 1807 their first child was born, a daughter. Sarah. The following year Thomas paid $200 for a farm a few miles south, 300 acres of stony ground on the Nolin Creek, a place called Sinking Spring for the cold water that welled up out of a cave mouth below the rise. On that rise he built a 1-room log cabin, 16 feet by 18, with a dirt floor and 1 small window and a chimney of clay and sticks, and it was there, on the 12th of February, 1809, on a corn husk and bearskin bed in the depths of a Kentucky winter, that Nancy gave birth to a son. They named him Abraham, after the grandfather who had fallen in the cornfield. No newspaper noted the event. No church bell rang. A 9-year-old cousin, Dennis Hanks, ran over from a neighbouring farm to see the new baby, took one look, and delivered the frontier's first recorded verdict on Abraham Lincoln, which was that he looked like a shriveled little red cherry, and that he would never come to much. History, it must be said, has not been kind to that prediction. The world this baby opened his eyes on was, by our standards, almost unimaginably bare. Everything the family ate, they grew or shot. Everything they wore, Nancy spun and sewed. Light was firelight, medicine was herbs and hope, and the nearest anything was miles away through the trees. And yet it would be wrong to picture the cabin as a place of misery, because it was simply a place of its time. One poor farm among thousands, and there was corn in the crib and mush in the pot, and a mother who sang hymns in the evening, and a father who could make a room laugh, and 2 small children growing in the firelight like seedlings on a windowsill. When Abraham was about 2, a dispute over the land title, the great chronic plague of Kentucky farmers, pushed the family off Sinking Spring, and they moved 10 miles to a better farm on Knob Creek, where the soil lay rich in the valley bottom between steep wooded hills. It is at Knob Creek that the boy's own memory begins, and the earliest things he could ever recall were these: planting pumpkin seeds in the rows while his father planted corn, and a great rain in the hills that washed the whole field away down the creek, seeds and all. Which is, when you think about it, a rather complete introduction to the life of a farmer. He remembered too the big road that ran past the farm, the old Cumberland Road, where all day long the traffic of the young nation went walking and creaking by the fence, peddlers and preachers, soldiers home from the wars, wagons headed west, and some days coffles of enslaved men and women being driven south in chains along the dust. A sight the little boy on the fence rail took in with those deep grey eyes and never afterward forgot. Kentucky was a slave state, and the county of his birth held more than 1,000 people in bondage, and though Thomas Lincoln was far too poor ever to own anyone, he hated the institution with a plain workingman's hatred, partly on scripture grounds, for he belonged to a small Baptist congregation that had actually split with its parent church over the question, and partly on bread and butter grounds, because a poor carpenter could not compete for wages against labour that was never paid at all. The son would say in later life that he could not remember a time when he did not think slavery was wrong, and the very first schoolroom of that conviction was his father's cabin and that fence rail on the Cumberland Road. There was little schooling at Knob Creek, of the frontier kind. In the slack seasons, Abraham and Sarah would walk 2 miles along the creek to what was called a blab school, a windowless log hut where children of every size recited their lessons out loud, all at once, at the top of their voices, so the master could hear by the general roar that everyone was working. A system of education that sounds, frankly, like a fine way to manufacture headaches, but it did its one essential job. Somewhere in that roaring hut, a small boy in a homespun shirt learned his letters, and the letters, though nobody in the valley could have guessed it, had found their greatest American friend. In 1816, when Abraham was 7, Thomas Lincoln finally lost patience with Kentucky. Another lawsuit had come crawling over his land title, threatening to take the Knob Creek farm out from under him, no matter how honestly he had paid for it. And across the Ohio River, there was a new kind of country, the free state of Indiana, fresh into the Union that very December, where the land was surveyed in clean federal squares, where a man's title, once bought from the government, was solid as iron, and where by law there was no slavery at all. So in the cold of that December, the family sold what could not be carried, loaded 2 horses, ferried the wide grey Ohio, and walked north into one of the most unbroken forests on the continent, 16 miles through country so wild that Thomas had to go ahead of the horses in places with an axe, chopping a path through the vines and the brush for his wife and his 2 children, into the woods of what would become Spencer County, Indiana, where the whole familiar world shrank to the little circle a fire could light. Their first Indiana winter, the family lived in what the frontier called a half-faced camp, which is a generous name for a shed of poles and brush, closed on 3 sides and wide open on the 4th, where a log fire was kept burning day and night against the cold, and the family slept on leaves and bearskins, with the snow hissing softly into the flames a few feet from their beds. Picture that for a moment, not with alarm, but gently, the way the boy himself would have known it. The black wall of the winter forest, the wolves far off, the fire snapping, the smell of wood smoke in everything, his mother humming low, his sisters breathing beside him, and the huge soft dark of the wilderness holding the little camp the way night holds a single lit window. By spring, Thomas and the neighbours had raised a proper cabin, and Thomas set about the endless work of turning forest into farm, and here the boy's childhood, in the plainest physical sense, came to an early end. An axe was put into his hands at the age of 7, and he would say afterward that from that day until his 23rd year, the axe was scarcely ever out of them. He grew tall shockingly fast, all wrists and shins, and the neighbours learned that the Lincoln boy could sink an axe deeper than most grown men, and his father hired him out, farm to farm, splitting rails, grubbing stumps, ploughing, butchering, daubing cabins, at 25 cents a day, every coin of which, under the law and custom of the time, belonged to his father, an arrangement the boy endured dutifully, and, we may safely guess, did not love. For the man he became would speak with feeling all his life about the right of every soul to eat the bread that his own hands had earned. Then came the autumn of 1818, and the great sorrow. That season a quiet poison moved through the little Pigeon Creek settlement. The cattle would wander deep in the woods and browse on a pale flowering plant called white snakeroot, and the poison of the plant passed into their milk, and the settlers, who had no way on earth of knowing this, drank the milk and sickened, and many died. They called it the milk sickness. It took Nancy's aunt and uncle first, the Sparrows who had followed them up from Kentucky, and Nancy nursed them both until the end, and then, in the last days of September, Nancy herself went down with it. The dizziness, the burning thirst, the terrible weakness, and there was nothing in the cabin or the county that could touch it. And on the 5th of October, 1818, with her 2 children beside the bed, Nancy Hanks Lincoln died. She was about 34 years old. Abraham was 9. Thomas built her coffin himself out of whipsawed planks, and it is told, and there is no reason to doubt it, that the boy whittled the wooden pegs that pinned the planks together. Small, careful work, the kind you give a grieving child so his hands have somewhere to put the grief. And they buried her on a wooded knoll south of the cabin, without a preacher, because there was no preacher within riding distance, and for months afterward the boy carried it heavily. The following year, Thomas did the sensible frontier thing, which was also, as it turned out, one of the luckiest things he ever did. He rode back to Elizabethtown, Kentucky, and called on a widow he had known for years, Sarah Bush Johnston, a tall, kindly, capable woman with 3 children of her own, and the 2 of them struck a plain bargain of mutual need, and married, and Thomas brought her north to the Indiana clearing with a wagon-load of what seemed to the Lincoln children like the treasures of Arabia, real furniture, a walnut bureau, feather beds, knives and forks, and, wonder of wonders, books. Sarah Bush Lincoln took one look at the 2 motherless children who met her at the cabin door, dirty, ragged, and hollow-eyed, and she gathered them in without hesitation and without difference, raising the 5 children of that blended household, hers and his as one brood, and of all the kindnesses in this long story, hers may be the one that mattered most, because this particular stepmother looked at this particular gangling, odd, dreamy boy and saw something in him. She defended his reading in a household and a whole neighbourhood that mostly regarded a boy sitting down with a book in daylight as a form of theft from his father. She was, he said in his last years, the best friend he ever had in this world. He called her Mamma, and when he was a grown man and a rising lawyer he would ride miles out of his way to sit with her, and one of the last private things he did before leaving for his inauguration, with the whole nation waiting on him, was to travel out to her farm and hold her hands and say goodbye. Under her roof, the boy and the books found each other in earnest, and this is the part of the story that everyone half remembers from childhood, the log cabin and the firelight, and the remarkable thing is that it is all essentially true. His entire formal schooling, added end to end, came to less than 1 year. Everything else he ever knew, the law, the mathematics, the history, the poetry, the surveying, the grammar, the statecraft, he taught himself. and he did it at night, by the light of the fire, flat on his stomach on the cabin floor, working sums on the back of a wooden fire shovel with a charred stick, shaving the shovel clean with a draw knife and working them again. Books on that frontier were rarer than money, and he read what the settlement could yield up, and the short list of them is worth saying slowly, because you can watch it building the man. The family Bible, whose cadences soaked so deep into him that his greatest speeches moved to its rhythms. Aesop's Fables, where a boy learns that a story with animals in it can carry a truth further than an argument can. Pilgrim's Progress. Robinson Crusoe, the poor castaway building a world with his hands, and A Borrowed Life of George Washington, which the boy famously tucked into a gap in the cabin logs one night, where the rain came through and ruined it, and he walked to the owner's farm and pulled corn for 2 or 3 days to pay the debt, and kept the ruined book, and read it to pieces, and lay awake thinking about the men who had fought for that word, liberty, and what it might have cost them, and what it might be worth. He read at the plough handles while the horse rested at the end of the row. He read with his dinner in one hand. He carried a book inside his shirt when he went out to work, and the neighbours shook their heads and told each other, not unkindly, that Tom Lincoln's boy was lazy, by which they meant only that he was forever reading, and the boy himself, with the whole apparatus of a very great mind assembling quietly behind those grey eyes, went on reading. He was growing into something the settlement had not quite seen before. By 17 he stood 6 feet 4 inches, one of the tallest men anyone in the county had ever laid eyes on, lean as a fence rail and strong as a grown ox, a boy who could take an axe by the end of the handle at arm's length and hold it out level and steady, and who could out-wrestle, out-lift, and outwork any hand on any farm, and who would then sit down on the woodpile at noon and draw a crowd, because along with the strength he had the other gift, his father's gift compounded, the storyteller's gift. He would climb up on a stump and give back the last preacher's sermon, word for word, gestures and all, until the men howled, and mimic the lawyers he had walked 15 miles to hear at the county courthouse, and tell stories so funny that the harvest crews would beg him to stop so they could breathe, and none of them quite noticed, between the laughing, that the boy asking idle-sounding questions at the edge of the field was quietly taking everything they knew, and keeping it. And then sorrow again, because this is a frontier story, and on the frontier, sorrow kept its own calendar. In January of 1828 his sister Sarah, his one companion from the Knob Creek days, married little more than a year and expecting her first child, died in childbirth 2 miles away, with her baby. And those who were present said that when they brought Abraham the news he sat down in the doorway of the cabin and buried his face in his hands, and the tears ran through his fingers, and something of that January stayed in his face for the rest of his life. He was 18 that winter, motherless now and sisterless, a boy with an axe and a borrowed book, and no visible future beyond his father's clearing, and the great world beyond the woods might as well have been on the moon. But the world was closer than it looked. It was, in fact, just down the creek, because water was the frontier's one great road, and that same spring the river reached out and touched him for the first time. A local storekeeper named James Gentry, the closest thing the settlement had to a rich man, needed a cargo of farm produce taken down the rivers to New Orleans, and he hired his son Alan and the big Lincoln boy to take it. At $8 a month, on a flatboat they built themselves, a great clumsy floating box of green timber, steered with long sweeps, that could travel in one direction only, downstream, which is, if you think about it, a fairly honest picture of being 19 years old. And so, in the spring of 1828, Abraham Lincoln floated out of the woods and down the Ohio and onto the Mississippi, and the continent unrolled before him, mile after mile after mile, 1,200 miles of it, plantations and river towns and steamboats churning past with music on their decks, more world in a month than he had seen in his whole previous life. One night, tied up at a plantation landing below Baton Rouge, the 2 boys were attacked in the dark by a gang of men who came aboard to rob the cargo, and the boys fought them off with clubs and fists, and cast off and fled downriver, and Lincoln carried a scar above his ear from that night for the rest of his days. And then there was New Orleans itself, the first true city he had ever seen. Masts thick as a forest along the levee, cotton bales stacked like hills, a dozen languages in the streets. And there, in the open markets of that city, the young man from the free woods of Indiana saw, for the first time in his life at full scale, human beings bought and sold, men and women and children examined and priced and handed over like livestock, in lots, under printed notices. As ordinary commerce, and though he said very little about it then, standing in his flatboatman's clothes at the edge of the crowd, the sight went into him and lodged there, and it did not leave. He came home up the river by steamboat, gave every dollar of his wages to his father, as the law required until he came of age, and went back to the axe. 2 years later the whole restless clan was moving again, this time to Illinois, where the letters from kin promised prairie soil so black and deep you could grow corn on it till the end of the world. In March of 1830, a caravan of ox wagons carried the extended Lincoln family 200 miles west to the Sangamon country of central Illinois, with the tall 21-year-old walking alongside, driving one of the teams, and that summer he helped his father raise one more cabin and split the rails to fence one more farm, 10 acres of them, rails that would come back into this story 30 years later in the strangest way, riding into a state convention on the shoulders of cheering men. And then, having seen his family planted, Abraham Lincoln did the quiet, enormous thing that every account of his life turns on. He came of age, and he left. No quarrel, no scene, just a young man with everything he owned in a bundle, walking away from the farm and the axe and his father's world of mud and debt and endless clearing, and striking out entirely alone to see what else a life might be made of. He took one more flatboat down to New Orleans first, for a bustling, none too reliable trader named Denton Offutt, and it was on that trip, in April of 1831, that the boat hung up on the mill dam at a tiny village called New Salem, perched on a bluff above the Sangamon River, and began to fill with water. And the whole village turned out on the bank to watch the stranger's predicament, offering, as riverbank crowds always have, an abundance of advice and no help whatsoever. And they watched the tallest of the strangers wade about with his trousers rolled, calm as a summer morning, shift the cargo aft, bore a hole in the bow to let the water run out, plug it, and ease the boat over the dam. And float on. And the village said to itself, more or less, now that was neatly done, and remembered him. Offutt remembered too, and when the trip was over he hired the young man to come back and clerk in a store he meant to open in that same village of New Salem. And so, in the summer of 1831, Abraham Lincoln walked into the little bluff-top settlement, a stranger, friendless, as he said himself, a piece of floating driftwood, 22 years old, and New Salem, population roughly 100 souls, took him in and made him. Everything important that happened to him for the next 6 years happened in that one small place, and the village gave him its gifts one at a time, like a fairy story, though the gifts were disguised, as the best gifts are, as work and failure and embarrassment. The store gave him a counter to lean on, and the whole passing village to talk to, and his stories drew loafers and customers alike until he was the best-known man on the bluff, and his fanatical honesty over pennies, walking miles at closing time to return a few cents overcharged, or handing a short-weighted quarter-pound of tea across the counter the next morning, earned him, while he was still almost a boy, the nickname that stuck to him through every courtroom and every campaign to the end, Honest Abe. The local wild boys, the Clary's Grove gang, gave him his standing. They ran the neighbourhood by muscle, and their champion, Jack Armstrong, was set on the new clerk by loud local wagering, and the two of them grappled in the dirt by the store with the whole county watching. And accounts differ, as they always do, about who was winning when it broke down into a general scuffle. But every account agrees on how it ended, with Lincoln backed against the store wall offering to fight the whole crowd one at a time, and Jack Armstrong pushing through the mob to shake his hand, and from that day the roughest men on the Sangamon were his devoted friends, his bodyguard, and eventually his voters, and years later, when Jack was dead and his son stood accused of murder, it would be a famous Springfield lawyer who came back, refused any fee, and saved the boy for his mother's sake. The village debating society gave him a stage, where the members were startled to find that the gangling storyteller, once he uncoiled from his chair, could argue a question with real order and force. A schoolmaster named Mentor Graham gave him grammar, sitting with him over a borrowed textbook after the day's work, drilling the axe-handed young man in moods and tenses like a boy at his letters. Because Lincoln had grasped the thing that would carry him further than anyone alive could have guessed. That in a self-governing country, the man who can put a true thing plainly has a power that no amount of money can buy. And in 1832, the village very nearly gave him a war. The Sauk leader Black Hawk crossed back into Illinois with his people that spring, trying to return to the cornfields on the Rock River from which they had been driven, and the frontier flared into panic and militia musters, and Lincoln volunteered, mostly, he admitted, because the store was failing and he needed the pay, and the men of his company did an extraordinary thing. They elected him captain, this 23-year-old with no property and no family name, over a prosperous local mill owner, and he said many times afterward, when far grander honours had been heaped on him, that no success in his life had given him so much genuine satisfaction as that one. His military career, he was always the first to say, was not storied. His company saw no fighting at all, and he joked in Congress years later that his war record consisted of bloody struggles with the mosquitoes and desperate charges upon the wild onion patches, which is the joke of a man who had noticed how cheaply other politicians wore their swords. But the war mattered all the same. In the quiet way things mattered in that village, for it showed him plainly that rough strangers would follow him, and on one hot day it showed the company something about their captain. When a harmless old Potawatomi man wandered into camp with a safe conduct paper, and the frightened militiamen closed in to kill him as a spy, and the captain stepped between them and the old man, and, by sheer force of standing there, swarthy with anger, dared any man present to go through him first, and none did. When the company mustered out, Lincoln walked home and stood for the state legislature, his first election, with 2 weeks to campaign, and he lost, the only time in his life, he liked to note, that he was ever beaten in a direct vote of the people, but his own precinct of New Salem. The neighbours who actually knew him gave him 277 votes out of 300 cast, and a young man capable of arithmetic could read a future in numbers like those. What followed the lost election was the leanest stretch of his life, and it is worth lingering in it a little, gently, because the man who later held a nation together was assembled, piece by piece, precisely here, in the years when nothing seemed to be going right. He bought into a village store with a partner named William Berry, on credit, everything on credit. And the store did what stores in dying villages do, it winked out, in his own dry phrase, and then Berry died, leaving Lincoln legally holding the debts of both men, a sum of $1,100, which to a man earning a few dollars a week might as well have been the Treasury of England, and the neighbours, joking and sympathetic at once, took to calling it the national debt. Now the frontier had a well-worn answer for a debt like that, and the answer was a fast horse and a new name in a new territory, and nobody would have been much surprised or even much scandalized. Instead, Lincoln went to his creditors and promised to pay every dollar, however long it took, and it took roughly 15 years, and he paid it, all of it, out of small salaries and smaller fees, and the reputation that purchase bought him, dollar by weary dollar, turned out to be the best investment any American politician ever made. To live in the meantime, he took whatever honest work the village had. He split rails again. He tended the mill. He was appointed postmaster of New Salem, a job he held for 3 years. Largely, he joked, because the office was too insignificant for his politics to be an objection, and he carried the letters around in his hat, which is where the tall hat's career as a filing cabinet begins. And he read every newspaper that came through, which meant that the postmaster of a 100-soul village on the Sangamon was, almost by accident, one of the best-informed men in the county on the affairs of the nation. and when the county surveyor needed a deputy, Lincoln, who knew nothing whatever about surveying, borrowed 2 books, taught himself trigonometry and the use of the compass and chain in 6 weeks of day and night study, the kind of headlong self-schooling that had become his signature, and went out and laid town lots and farm boundaries with such care that his lines were rarely disputed, and along the way, one hard season, when a judgment for debt took his horse and his surveying instruments, the neighbours quietly bought them back at the auction and handed them to him, because by now the whole neighbourhood had, so to speak, taken stock in the young man. In 1834 he ran for the legislature again, and this time won handily, and then won again and again and again, 4 terms in all, and in the state capital a Whig colleague named John Todd Stewart, a polished Springfield attorney who had marked the raw talent across the aisle, pressed him to study law and lent him the books, and Lincoln carried Blackstone's commentaries back to New Salem and read it under an oak tree, shifting around the trunk with the shade as the sun crossed the sky, which is as good a picture as this story owns of how the man worked, patient, absorbed, and moving with the light. In those same years the village handed him one more thing, the heaviest of its gifts. Among the families he boarded with was the tavern keeper's, and the tavern keeper's daughter, Anne Rutledge, was by every surviving account gentle, bright, and much loved, and the young Lincoln and Anne formed an attachment, an understanding, as the phrase went then, and in the burning August of 1835 the typhoid came up the river valley, and Anne died of it, at 22, and for weeks afterward Lincoln's friends were frightened for him, truly frightened, watching the steadiest man they knew walk the woods alone in a grief that looked bottomless, saying, on the worst days, that he could not bear the thought of the rain falling on her grave. He came back from it, slowly, the way he came back from everything, but the people who knew him longest said that from that season forward the deep sadness was always somewhere in the room with him, the melancholy that dripped from him as he walked, as his law partner later put it, and that it lived in him side by side all his life, with the jokes and the stories, the two of them taking turns at the windows of his face, and perhaps by now, drifting there in the dark, you can see how the one was the answer to the other, how a man builds a lantern of laughter precisely because he knows how dark the house can get. In 1836 he was licensed to practice law, and in April of 1837 28 years old. He rode into the new state capital of Springfield on a borrowed horse with everything he owned in 2 saddlebags, and walked into a store on the square to ask the price of a bed and bedding, and the young storekeeper, Joshua Speed, looking at the sad-faced stranger who confessed he could not pay, offered instead to share his own large room and bed upstairs. As men commonly did in that crowded frontier town, and Lincoln carried his saddlebags up, came down, and announced, in the phrase Speed remembered all his life, that he had moved, and Speed became the closest friend he ever had. Springfield in 1837 was raw as a fresh plank, mud to the axles in spring, hogs in the streets, but it was the capital. Thanks in no small part to legislator Lincoln's own horse trading, and it was full of young lawyers and politicians on the make, and into this company the newcomer settled as Stuart's junior partner, and the law made him, at last, a living. And the law did something else for him. It put him on the road, and here, gently now, we come back around to the beginning, because you remember. From the very start of tonight, before you were quite this sleepy, the rider on the enormous prairie at dusk, the tall man folded up on the slow horse, with his papers carried in the crown of his hat. That rider was Lincoln the circuit lawyer, and that is how he spent nearly 20 years of his life, and if you want to know where a backwoods politician learned to understand ordinary Americans better than any statesman of his century, it was there, on the 8th Judicial Circuit of Illinois, a sprawl of prairie counties covering thousands of square miles, around which the judge and a little troop of lawyers travelled together twice a year, spring and fall, months at a time, riding from courthouse village to courthouse village through the mud and the wind, trying whatever cases the county had saved up, sleeping 2 and 3 to a bed in taverns, where the lawyers were packed in like spoons and dinner was whatever the landlord shot. Most of the attorneys endured the circuit and fled home whenever court adjourned early. Lincoln, almost alone, loved it and stayed out the full round, every round, and you may make of that what you will, for the big house in Springfield was not always a peaceful one. But the plain truth is that out there in the tavern firelight, with the farmers and jurors and horse traders crowded in to hear him tell stories half the night, the man was gathering, case by case and county by county, face by face, an education in the American people that no university on earth could have sold him. And they, without knowing it, were taking his measure too, and passing the word along the prairie roads that the tall one, the sad funny one with the stovepipe hat, was the honestest lawyer and the best company in the state of Illinois. Meanwhile, back in Springfield, in the parlors above the mud, he had met his fate, and her name was Mary Todd. She was a Lexington banker's daughter, educated, quick, fluent in French, plump and pretty and proud, visiting her married sister in the finest house in town, and she could talk politics like a senator, and had, since girlhood, told friends with perfect seriousness that she intended to marry a man who would be president one day, a remark her Springfield suitors doubtless found charming, and one of them, improbably, would make come true. The courtship of the polished Todd sister and the rail-splitter lawyer scandalized her family and ran anything but smooth, and at one point, on the first day of January 1841, the engagement broke entirely, in circumstances still argued over, and Lincoln went down into the blackest depression of his adult life, unable to attend the legislature, frightening his friends so badly that Speed quietly removed his razor from the room, and writing to his law partner that he was the most miserable man living, and that whether he would ever be better he could not tell. He did get better. He and Mary were gently manoeuvred back together by friends, and on a rainy November evening in 1842 they were married in her sister's parlour, and inside the ring he gave her were engraved 3 words, "Love is eternal," and whatever storms that marriage weathered, and it weathered many, those words were never taken back on either side. The newlyweds began life in a rented room over a tavern, at $4 a week, which Mary, raised with enslaved servants in a Kentucky mansion, bore with more grace than her family expected, and within 2 years the law practice had prospered enough for Lincoln to buy the only house he would ever own. A story-and-a-half cottage at the corner of 8th and Jackson Streets in Springfield, painted a Quaker brown, where the couple would live for 17 years, and where their boys were born, Robert in 1843, Edward in 1846, William, called Willie, in 1850, and Thomas in 1853, whom his father, noting the baby's oversized head and wriggling body, nicknamed Tadpole, and Tad he remained forever. As a father, Lincoln was, by the unanimous and slightly exasperated testimony of the neighbourhood, hopelessly, extravagantly indulgent. He let the boys ransack his office on Sundays while he thought, pulling books off shelves and upending inkstands, to the silent fury of his law partner, and he hauled them up and down the street in a little wagon while reading a book with the other hand, occasionally failing to notice for half a block that a passenger had tumbled out. And the general Springfield verdict, delivered over many a fence, was that the Lincolns' children were being ruined, to which their father's whole theory of parenting, stated more than once, was that love is the chain whereby to bind a child to its parents, and he bound them, and they adored him. In 1844 he took a junior partner of his own, a bristling, book-hungry, hero-worshipping young man named William Herndon, and the sign that went up, Lincoln and Herndon, hung over the office for the rest of Lincoln's life, and the firm's ledger tells you the man better than any speech. Fees of $5 and $10 and $20, farmers' quarrels and merchants' notes, the endless, small, honest business of a prairie state, argued in his shirt sleeves with his galluses showing, and the office itself a legendary chaos of papers, in the midst of which sat one bulging envelope labelled, in his own hand, with the instruction that if you cannot find it anywhere else, look in this. Politics, meanwhile, kept its slow pull on him. He had served his 4 terms in the legislature, and in 1846 he reached for the next rung and won it, a seat in the National Congress, and in December of 1847 the family took rooms in a Washington boarding house across from the Capitol, and the 1 term he served there was, by the ordinary measures of a career, a failure, and an instructive one. The country was at war with Mexico, a war the young Whig congressman believed had been provoked dishonestly, and he stood up in the House, a freshman from the prairie, and demanded that the President of the United States show the exact spot of American soil where American blood had first been shed, pressing the point in resolution after resolution, and the President ignored him. And the Illinois papers mauled him, and even his own partner warned him the district was against him, and the district was. He had pledged himself to a single term regardless, and he went home in 1849 at 40 years old with his political prospects, as nearly everyone including himself could see, finished, a one-term ex-congressman famous chiefly for an unpopular question. And if the story had ended there, history would have filed him, at most, as a footnote with a good sense of humour. One souvenir of those Washington years deserves its small place here, because it is so perfectly him. Remembering his flatboat days and a steamer he had once helped work off a sandbar, he whittled and rigged a model of a device for lifting grounded riverboats over shoals with inflatable chambers, and was granted United States Patent number 6469. And the invention was never manufactured and never earned a dime, but he remains, to this night, the only president of the United States who ever held a patent, and the model he carved sits in the Smithsonian, and somewhere in that fact the cabin boy and the tinkering mind and the faith in improvement is the whole cast of the man. So he came home, and almost at once the family's own sky darkened, for in the first days of February, 1850, after 52 days of illness that the doctors could name but not touch, little Edward, their second son, died in the house at 8th and Jackson, a month short of his 4th birthday, and Mary collapsed into a grief so consuming that her husband, carrying his own, had to coax her to eat, and the house learned a silence it had not known before. They planted a rosebush by the small grave, and in December of that same year another baby, Willie, came to the house like light returning to a window, and life as it does went on, but those who study this family agree that neither parent ever fully put the little coffin down. And then, for 5 years, Lincoln did something remarkable for a politician. He stopped being one, almost entirely, and threw himself into the law with both hands, and these, his friends agreed, were his happiest years. The circuit twice a year, the stories in the taverns, the boys growing at 8th and Jackson, and a practice climbing steadily toward the top of the Illinois bar. The railroads were lacing themselves across the prairie in those years, and the biggest of them, the Illinois Central, took him on for major litigation, and in one celebrated tax case he saved the company a fortune and then had to sue his own client to collect his $5,000 fee, the largest of his life, and won that too, which tells you that mildness and softness are not the same thing. In 1857 he defended the owners of the first railroad bridge ever thrown across the Mississippi, after a steamboat struck it and burned, in a case that was really a contest between the old river and the coming rails, between north-south water and east-west iron, and his argument that a man has as good a right to cross a river as another has to sail up it, helped clear the legal road for the transcontinental future he would later, as president, sign into law. And in 1858 came the case the movies were made of, when the son of Jack Armstrong, the very man who had wrestled him in the New Salem dirt a quarter-century before, stood trial for murder after a midnight brawl at a camp meeting, and the state's witness swore he had seen the fatal blow clearly, at 11 at night, by the light of the moon, and Lincoln, defending the boy without fee for his widowed mother Hannah, who had mended his shirts when he was a penniless clerk, produced an almanac showing that at that hour the moon was low and setting, and hardly a lamp at all, and the witness's certainty fell apart, and the jury freed the boy, and somewhere in that courtroom you may see every thread of this story pulled together at once. The wrestling match, the village kindnesses, the debts of friendship paid across decades, and the quiet country conviction that facts, patiently produced, beat swearing every time. He was now as far up as an Illinois lawyer could climb, prosperous at last, famous across the state, a big house, a carriage, silver on the table, and it is exactly here, in the contented middle of the 1850s, that the great national storm which had been rumbling all his life sometimes near, sometimes far, finally broke and called him out of private life for good, and the name of the thunderclap was the Kansas-Nebraska Act. To feel why it shook him, you must hold in mind the one belief he had carried since the fence rail on the Cumberland Road, the belief his whole political life would be built on, that slavery was a wrong, a vast national wrong, but a wrong which the founders had fenced, he believed, into the states where it already stood, and set on a course, as he read them, of slow and ultimate extinction, and that the free Western territories, the enormous open future of the country, were to be free soil forever, the fair unfenced racecourse for the poor man's son. And in May of 1854, the Congress, led by the most powerful politician in the land, who happened also to be an Illinois man, Senator Stephen Douglas, tore that fence down. The new law repealed the old Missouri Compromise line and declared that the settlers of each new territory might vote slavery in or out for themselves, and Douglas called this popular sovereignty and professed himself grandly indifferent to the outcome, and across the North the news landed like a dropped kettle in a sleeping house. It found Lincoln, his partner said, thunderstruck, and it woke him, in his own phrase, as he had never been aroused before, and that autumn, at the State Fair in Springfield and again at Peoria, the half-retired lawyer stood up and answered Douglas in a speech 3 hours long that people came away from with the sense of having heard the argument of their own hearts stated at last, that the declaration that all men are created equal was not a decoration but a promise, that no man was good enough to govern another without that other's consent, that the monstrous injustice of slavery deprived the Republic's example of its just influence in the world, and that the nation must turn back toward the faith of its fathers or lose its own soul. He was careful, always, and slow, always, more cautious by far than the abolitionists, whose zeal he did not share and whose tactics he doubted, and history has had a long argument with his slowness. But from Peoria forward the direction never changed, and the prairie lawyer had found the cause that would carry him, though no one dreamed it yet, to the very top of the storm. He ran for the Senate in 1855, in the old way, through the legislature, and led on the first ballot, and when the votes would not come his way he did a thing politicians are not famous for. He handed his supporters to a rival, an anti-Nebraska Democrat, named Trumbull, to make certain the seat at least went to the cause, and swallowed the disappointment, which was sharp, and went back to the circuit, and waited, and the country, faster and faster now, came his way. The political world of his youth was breaking up like river ice in March. The old Whig party, his party, the party of roads and banks and improvement, cracked apart on the slavery question and sank, and out of the wreckage across the North a new party was assembling itself, taking the old Republican name of Jefferson's day, gathering in free soil Whigs and rebellious Democrats, and every shade of anti-slavery feeling under one broad roof. And in May of 1856, at the new party's first Illinois convention in Bloomington, Lincoln threw in with them for good, and delivered a speech of such reported power that the newspapermen, by the old story, simply laid down their pencils and forgot to write, so that it is remembered forever as the lost speech, which is, a cynic might note, one of the surest roads to immortality a speech has ever taken, since no surviving text has ever had to live up to the legend. 2 years later, the new party of Illinois did the natural thing and named the Bloomington orator as its candidate for the United States Senate against the giant himself, Stephen Douglas, the little giant, the most famous Democrat in America. And Lincoln opened that campaign in the State House at Springfield in June of 1858 with the speech that fixed his name in the national mind, built on a sentence out of Scripture that every farmer in the audience knew in his bones, that a house divided against itself cannot stand. He did not believe, he said, that the Union would be dissolved. He did not expect the house to fall, but he believed it would cease to be divided, that it must become, in time, all one thing or all the other, and his friends winced at the boldness of it, and told him it would cost him the election, and it probably did, and it also happened to be true. And he had reached the point in his life, somewhere out on those prairie roads, where given a choice between the useful and the true, he had quietly stopped choosing the useful. What followed, through the late summer and autumn of 1858, were the 7 debates, Lincoln and Douglas, face to face on wooden platforms in 7 Illinois towns, and they have become such a marble monument in American memory that it is worth restoring, gently, what they actually were, which is the best free show the prairie ever had. 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 people would pour into a town of 2,000 by special train and farm wagon and afoot, with brass bands and banners and cannon salutes and vendors crying watermelons and whiskey. And on the platform the contrast alone was worth the trip. Douglas short, round, magnificent, deep-voiced, in tailored broadcloth, with a ruffled shirt, travelling by private railcar, and Lincoln a head and a half taller, gaunt, rumpled, in his old tall hat, arriving by ordinary coach, unfolding himself upward to speak in that high-carrying tenor that could reach the last row of a crowd like a fiddle string over a drum, and for 3 hours at a stretch, hour to open, hour and a half to reply, half hour to close, the two of them argued before those enormous patient standing crowds the deepest question the country owned. What the founders had meant when they said that all men are created equal, and whether a great republic could go on forever half slave and half free. And it must be told plainly, here in the dark, that Lincoln in those debates was a man of his own century, and not of ours, and said so, disclaiming social and political equality between the races in words that are painful to hear now, and the honest way to hold it is the way the scholars hold it, that he stood, on the question of black citizenship, well behind the abolitionists of his own day, and well ahead of the great mass of the voters in front of him, and that he planted in the teeth of those crowds the one seed from which everything after grew, that in the right to eat the bread that his own hands have earned, the black man was his equal, and Douglas's equal, and the equal of every living man. When the votes were counted that November, the districting of the day gave the legislature to Douglas's party, and the legislature gave Douglas the seat, and Lincoln had lost again, and he took it the way he took things, telling a friend it was a slip and not a fall, and telling another that he felt like the boy who stubbed his toe in the dark, too big to cry and far too badly hurt to laugh. But something had happened that no vote count could undo. The debates had been transcribed by shorthand reporters, a brand new marvel in those years, and reprinted in full in the great Eastern papers, and the country at large, reading along, had discovered what the Eighth Circuit had known for years, and the beaten candidate began to receive, from states he had never set foot in, invitations to come east and be looked at. And in February of 1860 he accepted the biggest of them, and took the cars for New York City to speak at the Cooper Union. It is one of the famous evenings of American history, and it nearly buckled at the start. The hall held 1,500 of the most polished people in the country, editors, merchants, poets, and what walked onto the stage was a Western giant in a new broadcloth suit badly creased from a carpet-bag, all wrists and knees, hair in rebellion, and the audience settled in with the particular chill of city people preparing to be amused by the provinces, and for a few minutes, by every account, it went as badly as it looked, the strange voice too high, the accent pure backwards. And then the speech itself took hold, and the chill left the room, for what the prairie lawyer had brought to New York was not folksiness, but the most rigorous piece of historical homework the slavery debate had yet produced. Months of his own digging through the records of the founding generation, showing, signer by signer, vote by vote, that the very men who framed the Constitution had themselves again and again voted to keep slavery out of the national territories, that the fathers Douglas invoked stood, in fact, on Lincoln's side of the fence, and he closed by turning to the South directly, gently, reasonably, devastatingly, and then to his own side, with the sentence the crowd rose roaring to its feet on, "That right makes might, and in that faith let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it." That same day, before the speech, he had stopped in at the studio of the photographer Matthew Brady, and the portrait made that afternoon, the left hand resting on a stack of books, the strong, homely face composed and steady, was reproduced by the tens of thousands in the months that followed, and Lincoln said afterward, with how much of a smile we can only guess, that Brady and the Cooper Union speech had made him president. He was suddenly, improbably, a contender, and when the Republicans gathered that May of 1860 in Chicago, in a huge pine barn of a convention hall thrown up for the occasion, and nicknamed the Wigwam, the managers of the favourite, the polished New York Senator William Seward arrived to find the Lincoln men had gotten there first, in every sense, papering the galleries with leather-lunged supporters, and, in the theatrical masterstroke of the season, marching into a state rally 2 weathered fence rails borne like holy relics, split, the banner said, by the candidate himself in his pioneer youth. And just like that, the complicated Springfield attorney was reborn in the national imagination as the rail splitter, the poor boy of the woods, honest Abe of the West. And it was the truth, and it was also, as he might have said himself with that sideways look, remarkably convenient truth. The candidate stayed home in Springfield, as custom then demanded, playing handball in a vacant lot and answering telegrams, while in the Wigwam his managers traded and promised through the night in exactly the manner he had wired them not to. And on the third ballot the convention broke to Lincoln in an avalanche, and the roar inside the pine barn was heard, they said, a mile off on the lake. The election that followed was really 4 elections at once, for the Democratic Party had finally torn itself in 2 over slavery, North from South, Douglas from Breckinridge, with a 4th candidate, Bell, gathering the border, and through it all Lincoln never made a single campaign speech, and on the night of the 6th of November, 1860, sitting in the Springfield telegraph office as the wires ticked in the returns, he learned that with not quite 40% of the popular vote, and with his name not even printed on the ballot in 10 southern states, he had been elected the 16th President of the United States, and he walked home through the celebrating streets some time after midnight, and told his sleeping wife, and lay down, and did not sleep, for he understood, better perhaps than any man in the exulting crowds outside, exactly what was now coming. 6 weeks later, South Carolina voted itself out of the Union, and one by one through the winter the states of the Deep South followed, 7 of them by February, seizing forts and arsenals as they went, and formed themselves into a confederacy sworn to independence, and the outgoing administration in Washington wrung its hands and did nothing, and the president-elect in Springfield, with no army, no office, and no power yet of any kind, grew a beard, partly, the story goes, because an 11-year-old girl in New York State, one Grace Bedell, had written to advise him that his face was too thin, and that the ladies liked whiskers, and he had written gravely back, weighing the matter, and taken her counsel, which is the last purely charming event in this story for a considerable while. And since the whole country was, in that winter of waiting, leaning in to look at this suddenly enormous unknown, let us lean in with them, unhurried, and take the portrait properly, because we have walked beside this man since the cornhusk bed, and we have earned a long look at him. He stood 6'4" in his stockings, and the tall hat carried him towards 7, and he weighed about 180 pounds, which on that frame looked like less, all of it wire and tendon, the arms too long, the great hands like a labourer's still, knuckled and brown, hands that visitors who came to sneer noticed first and stopped sneering at, because they were plainly hands that had done everything the visitors had not. He walked with a flat-footed, deliberate gait, the whole soul planted at once, the walk of a man who has ploughed fields all his life, leaning slightly forward as if perpetually about to pick something up. And he dressed, his friends admitted and his enemies feasted, indifferently, the black suits hanging off him like sails in a calm, the trousers always at half-mast above the big boots, the black stock tied anyhow at the throat, and none of it mattered in the least once he began to talk. The face was the thing the age never settled its argument about. In repose it was, everyone agreed, one of the saddest and homeliest faces in public life, the skin sallow and creased like brown paper, the cheeks caved, the mole, the great ears, the coarse black hair that no brush had ever civilized, the grey eyes set so deep under the shelf of brow that in photographs they read as wells of shadow, and the photographs, mind you, were part of the problem. For the long exposures of that day required a held stillness, and stillness on that face meant melancholy, so the camera caught the sorrow every time and the laughter never once. But let a story take him, the witnesses all say, and the whole apparatus lit from inside like a paper lantern. The eyes went bright, the wrinkles rearranged themselves into an instrument of pure mischief, and men who had just pronounced him the ugliest fellow in Illinois found themselves writing home, bewildered that in full flight he was very nearly handsome, and no portrait ever made of him, they said, was truly like him, because the essential thing about the face was that it moved. The voice surprised everyone in the other direction. Out of that deep chest they expected thunder, and what came was a high, clear, penetrating tenor, edged with the Kentucky and Indiana of his boyhood, thin at the very start of a speech, when he was nervous and the sound wavered, and then settling, strengthening and carrying wonderfully, to the fringe of a crowd of 20,000 in an age with nothing to help it, which is a good part of why the crowds of the debates could actually hear the argument, and the argument could actually change the country. And the mind behind the voice worked, by every close account we have, at its own unhurried temperature, and this may be the most restful fact about him, and worth taking down into sleep with you. He was not quick, and knew it and said it, comparing himself to a piece of steel, very hard to scratch, and almost impossible, once you had gotten something on it, to rub it off. Herndon, who shared an office with the mind for 16 years, said he thought slowly and moved slowly, like the tide, and like the tide could not be hurried and could not be stopped, that he read less and thought more than any man in the country, working a proposition over silently for days, walking with it, sitting with it wrapped in his shawl by the fire with it, until he had ground it down to its plainest possible statement. And when at last it came out so simple that a child could carry it, and so solid that no orator alive could break it. And men mistook the simplicity for simpleness right up until the moment the argument closed over them. His habits were, for his century, almost comically mild. He did not drink, having seen what the jug did to the frontier, though he would lift a glass to touch and set it down, and he did not smoke, and he did not swear beyond an occasional by jings, and he did not, could not, hold a grudge. A defect, his partner called it, in a lawyer, and the single indulgence of his body was the one his stepmother had licensed by the fire at Pigeon Creek. Print, always print. Read lying down when he could manage it, stretched on the office sofa with his legs over the arm and chairs enlisted as needed, reading aloud, to Herndon's daily torment. Because, he explained reasonably, when he read aloud 2 senses caught the idea, and he remembered it longer. Shakespeare he read all his life, deeper than any president before or since, Macbeth above all, and the sad plain poems he loved. He recited so often his friends learnt them entire, and the Bible he could quote to any purpose, and the humorists of the day he kept stacked by the bed at the White House like medicine, which is exactly what they were. As for what he believed out beyond politics, he kept the door of that room mostly shut, and we will not force it here in the dark, but those nearest him agreed on the shape of it. No church membership ever. A young man's open scepticism mellowed year by year into something older and stranger. A bone-deep fatalism inherited maybe from his Baptist parents with their doctrine of foreordained things. A sense, which the war would deepen almost into theology, that he was an instrument in a very large hand, that events had controlled him more than he had controlled events, and alongside it, unkillable, the superstitions of the frontier boy, the meaning dreams, the omens, of which the strangest is this, told by his friend Lamon, that in the days after his election he lay on a sofa opposite a bureau mirror and saw himself doubled in the glass, 2 faces at once, one hale, one pale as death, and that it came back a second time and then never again, and Mary, when he told her, read it the way the frontier read such things, that he would be twice elected, and would not live out the second term, and you may make of that what the century and a half since has made of it, a story polished in the telling perhaps, but he told it, and it stayed with him, and it stays, you will find, with everyone who hears it. That is the whole man then, as near as the distance lets us come, the strength and the sadness, the slow steel mind, the lantern face, the high-carrying voice, the shawl and the stovepipe hat with the papers in the crown, and it was this whole man, so local, so unlikely, so thoroughly homemade, whom the trains were now waiting to carry east into the storm. And it is time, now that you have him by heart, to let the trains have him. The last weeks in Springfield have a hush over them, even now, even from here. The president-elect wound up his law practice and told Herndon to leave the sign, Lincoln and Herndon, hanging just as it was, for if he lived, he said, he was coming back some day, and then they would go right on practicing as if nothing had ever happened. He rented out the house at 8th and Jackson, sold the furniture, roped the family trunks himself, and labelled them in his own hand. Simply, A. Lincoln, White House, Washington, and made one last private journey, 70 miles down to the farm in Coles County, to sit an afternoon with his stepmother, Sarah Bush Lincoln, now in her 70s, the woman who had defended the boy and his books, and she held his hands and wept, and told him plainly that she feared she would never see him again, that something would happen to him. And he comforted her as best he could, and it is one of the quiet mercies of this story that she was wrong in nothing except the direction of the fear, for she outlived him. Then, on the morning of the 11th of February, 1861, a cold rain falling, he stood on the rear platform of his train at the Springfield depot before 1,000 of his neighbours with their umbrellas dripping, and said an unprepared goodbye that the reporters took down as he spoke, that to this place and the kindness of these people he owed everything, that he had lived there a quarter of a century and passed from a young man to an old one, that his children had been born there and one lay buried there, and that he was leaving now with a task before him greater than that which rested upon Washington, not knowing when or whether ever he might return, and he asked them to pray for him, and the train pulled out into the rain, and Springfield never saw him alive again. The journey east was 12 days of crowds and speeches, flag-raisings and torchlight, and underneath the celebration, moving with the train like weather, ran the dread, because the mail now brought assassination threats by the bundle, and in Baltimore, a slave-holding city seething with secession feeling through which the rail line to Washington had to pass, detectives working for the railroad, led by one Allan Pinkerton, believed they had uncovered a definite plot to kill him at the depot. And so the last leg was played like a scene from a novel nobody would publish. The president-elect slipping out of Harrisburg at dusk in a soft felt hat instead of the famous stovepipe, the telegraph wires cut behind him, passing through Baltimore unannounced in the middle of the night in a sleeping berth reserved for an invalid passenger, and arriving in Washington at dawn, unrecognized. And the hostile press had a carnival with it, sketching the man of the people sneaking into the Capitol in disguise, and the ridicule stung him, and he said afterward that he did not believe he had been in danger and regretted the whole arrangement. But his friends never regretted it, and the plain fact which the country would learn by heart soon enough was that the threats were not wind. And so to the 4th of March, 1861, Inauguration Day, a raw grey morning with sharpshooters on the rooftops along Pennsylvania Avenue and artillery parked at the corners, the Capitol itself half southern in its sympathies, the unfinished dome of the Capitol standing open to the sky with a crane jutting from its top, which the President-elect, characteristically, insisted was exactly as it should be, a sign the Union itself would go on and be completed, and on the east portico, before a vast anxious crowd, the oath was administered by the ancient Chief Justice Taney, author of the very Dred Scott decision the new president's whole movement stood against, history enjoying, as it often does, a taste for uncomfortable seating arrangements. The address he delivered at noon had been drafted in a back room in Springfield, with 4 documents open on the table, and then softened, line by line, on the advice of Seward from argument toward embrace, and it made the southern states 2 promises and 1 refusal, the promise that he had no purpose and no lawful right to interfere with slavery where it already existed, the promise that there would be no invasion and no violence, unless it was forced upon the national authority, and the refusal, calm and absolute, to accept that any state could lawfully leave the Union, which he held to be perpetual, older than the Constitution itself, and he told them plainly that in their hands, not his, lay the momentous issue of civil war, that the government would not assail them, and that they could have no conflict without being themselves the aggressors, and then, reaching past the politicians to whatever remained of the common American heart, he closed with the passage that generations of schoolchildren have stood and recited since, that we are not enemies, but friends, that we must not be enemies, that though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection, and that the mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, would yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they would be, by the better angels of our nature. It was, by common consent then and since, one of the noblest state papers in the language, and it changed almost nothing, for the Cotton States were gone in their own minds already, and the very next morning the new president found on his desk a letter from the commander of the tiny federal garrison holding Fort Sumter, a brick pentagon on an island in the mouth of Charleston Harbor, reporting that his provisions would be exhausted in about 6 weeks, and with that letter the presidency of Abraham Lincoln truly began. 6 weeks on the clock, a cabinet of strangers who mostly thought themselves his betters, an army of 16,000 men scattered across a continent, and a decision, the first of the war, that no one on earth could make but him. He was, it needs remembering here, the least prepared man, on paper ever to hold the office in a crisis, a one-term congressman who had never governed so much as a county, never commanded anything grander than a company of volunteers who fought only mosquitoes, and the great men of his own cabinet, Seward at State, Chase at Treasury, each of whom believed the convention had nominated the wrong man, expected to manage him as a figurehead, and Seward in those first weeks actually put the proposition on paper, a memorandum gravely offering to take the direction of policy himself, and the president answered him in a note so quiet, so courteous, and so unmistakable that the subject never rose again. And Seward, a big enough man to recognize a bigger one, wrote home to his wife that executive force and vigour were rare qualities, and that the president was the best of them all, and became, in time, his most devoted friend in the government. The Sumter decision itself he made in the way that would become his signature, listening to everyone, deciding late, and then not moving an inch. Nearly the whole cabinet, and the general-in-chief, the aged hero Winfield Scott, advised him to give the fort up as indefensible. And he could not, for he had just sworn an oath, and the fort was the flag, and so he found the narrow channel between surrender and aggression, and notified the governor of South Carolina that he would send the garrison bread, only bread, provisions for hungry men. No troops, no arms, no ammunition, and thereby placed the choice exactly where his inaugural had placed it, in their hands, and in the black hours before dawn on the 12th of April, 1861, the batteries ringing Charleston Harbor opened fire on Fort Sumter and on the flag of the United States, and after 34 hours of bombardment, the garrison hauled the colours down, and the news went out over the wires, and the long argument was over, and the war had come. What followed Sumter was an astonishment that historians still shake their heads over, for the sleepy divided North rose like one man. The president called for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 90 days, which tells you how long nearly everyone, on both sides, expected the business to take, and the states answered with more men than he asked for. Farm boys and clerks and college students crowding the depots with brass bands playing, and in the border South the same call tore the last middle ground away. And Virginia went out, and with her Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina, 11 states now, and the new Confederacy moved its capital to Richmond, 100 miles from Washington, so that for 4 years the two capitals would glare at each other across a single Virginia county line, and the war settled onto exactly the ground everyone could see it must. Those first months taught the president his job in the hardest school ever kept. Washington itself, ringed by slaveholding Maryland and Virginia, was for one breathless week in April actually cut off, the rail lines broken and the telegraph dead, and Lincoln paced the empty White House watching the Potomac for the relief regiments, and when they finally came, the famous New York 7th marching up the avenue with their band playing, the Capitol breathed again, and the President had learned the first great lesson, that holding the border, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, mattered more than any single battle, and he held it through that first year with a mixture of patience, loyally cunning, and iron, suspending the ancient writ of habeas corpus along the military lines, jailing secessionist agitators without trial, and taking for it a storm of criticism that has never entirely died down, answering, in his plain way, the question he put to Congress that summer, whether all the laws but one were to go unexecuted, and the government itself go to pieces lest that one be violated. He would stretch the Constitution to save the Union that gave the Constitution life, and he knew he was stretching it, and said so, and the argument about where necessity ends has been going on ever since, which is perhaps exactly what he would have wanted, since the whole point of the exercise was to preserve a country where the argument could go on. In July came the first great battle, and the first great humiliation. The Green Union Army marched out to a Virginia creek called Bull Run, with congressmen and picnic hampers trailing behind to watch the show, and by sundown that army was streaming back toward Washington in a rain-soaked panic, and Lincoln, who had waited all afternoon at the telegraph, sat up the whole night hearing the eyewitnesses, and did not rage, and did not despair, but by morning had written out a memorandum of military policy, longer terms of enlistment, more men, a real blockade, simultaneous pressure at many points, that military historians still cite with a certain wonder, because it shows the untrained prairie lawyer on the morning after his first defeat, already groping toward the grand strategy that would, 4 years and rivers of grief later, win the war. And here we must introduce the great instructive frustration of these middle years, the general with everything but the one thing. To rebuild the beaten army Lincoln called in George McClellan, 34 years old, brilliant, magnetic, tireless at organisation, and McClellan took the wreck of Bull Run and forged it into the Army of the Potomac, 120,000 drilled and devoted men, one of the finest instruments ever assembled on the continent, and then, having built the sword, found himself unable to swing it. Autumn passed in reviews and parades, winter passed, the country and the Congress and the Treasury groaned, and the general found always one more reason to wait. Always the enemy doubled in his imagination, and to the President, who kept urging and prodding with a patience that his own cabinet found maddening, the general responded with a condescension that makes the letters painful reading even now, styling the President in private an idiot and a well-meaning baboon, snubbing him in his own house. And Lincoln bore it all, saying only, in the phrase that has outlived every parade, that he would gladly hold McClellan's horse if the man would only bring victories. It is worth pausing on that, here in the quiet, because it is the key to how this particular man wielded power. He had, his secretary said, no personal vanity to wound, none, and so insults simply found nothing in him to burn, and he measured every man by a single question: does he fight? Does he move the cause? And he would suffer any arrogance from a man who delivered and remove any friend who did not. And this freedom from the need to be deferred to, rarest of all qualities in high office, was worth armies to him, and cost him nothing but what other men would have called pride, an expense he seemed never to notice. Through that same first winter he was teaching himself, from a standing start, the science of war, borrowing, works on strategy from the Library of Congress, and sitting up past midnight over the maps, as he had once sat over Blackstone under the oak tree, until the astonished young officers at the War Department found that the President could talk lines of operation and interior positions with the best of them, and his military telegrams, read today, traced the learning curve of possibly the aptest student the art of war ever had, arriving, by the middle of the conflict, at the two blunt insights his professional generals took longest to see: that the true objective was the enemy's army, not his capital, and that the Union's advantage in numbers meant nothing unless it was pressed everywhere at once, so the smaller foe could not shuttle his strength from one threatened point to another. The war widened that year like a slow flood out along the rivers of the West, where victories finally began to come from an unglamorous, cigar-chewing brigadier named Grant, of whom we shall hear a great deal more, and out to sea, where the blockade tightened port by port, and once, in November, nearly across the Atlantic, when a Union warship stopped a British mail steamer, the Trent, and dragged 2 Confederate envoys off her deck, and Britain, affronted, rattled toward war, and the cabinet breathed fire, and the president, observing quietly that one war at a time was quite sufficient, let the envoys go, and the storm passed, which is how close the whole story came, more than once, to becoming a different and darker story altogether. And all the while, behind the state papers and the telegrams, there was the house itself, and the family in it, because the White House of those years was not a museum. It was a home with small boys in it, Willie and Tad, who kept goats that hauled them through the East Room on a kitchen chair, who held court-martials of their toy soldiers on the roof and pardoned every one, whose father, the most burdened man on the continent, would lie on the floor of his office and wrestle with them while senators waited. And the house rang. Visitors recorded with some disapproval, with laughter, and that laughter was, though nobody used such words then, a medicine of state, as necessary to the man as sleep, of which he got almost none. Let us rest a moment from the marching and look at the man's ordinary day, because the presidency of those years was, hour by hour, a stranger and more human thing than the marble lets on. He rose before dawn, having slept little and eaten less, an egg and coffee often serving for the whole of breakfast, and he was at the desk in his second-floor office, a plain room with war maps on the walls, and a view of the unfinished Washington Monument standing stump like above the mudflats before the rest of the house stirred, reading the overnight telegrams. And then the doors opened, and the day came at him like a river in flood. There was no appointments secretary who could hold the line against him, because he would not let the line be held, and up the public staircase all day every day came the country itself, senators wanting generals removed, generals wanting senators removed, inventors with folding boats and rifle sights, ministers with resolutions, mothers with sons in the guardhouse, and he heard them, chair by chair, hour after hour, and his 2 young secretaries, Nicolay and Hay, who guarded him with the ferocity of terriers, and adored him with the irreverence of sons, referring to him in their private letters as the tycoon and the ancient, watched him give away his hours to obscure grieving strangers and could do nothing about it, because he told them, when they protested, that these visits renewed him, that he must never forget the popular assemblage from which he had sprung, and that no hours of his day were better employed. The cabinet he presided over has become a legend of its own, the team of rivals, half of them men who had run against him and believed the presidency had been handed to the wrong Illinoisan, and the marvel is not that he assembled them, but that he played them, for years, like a hand of country whist, absorbing Chase's endless intrigues for the succession with an amused patience that drove his. Friends Wild, remarking that Chase's presidential fever was a chin-fly he did not care to brush off so long, as it kept the Treasury pulling its plough, and when at last Chase overplayed and resigned once too often, the president accepted the resignation to universal astonishment, and then, months later, to an astonishment even more universal, appointed the same schemer Chief Justice of the United States, explaining to a sputtering visitor that he would rather have a man of Chase's ability on the bench than a smaller man who had merely been loyal, and that he could not let a private grudge sit in a chair where the freedom of millions might one day be argued. That, drifting listener, is what the historians mean when they say the man had almost no ego in his working parts, and it was rarer in Washington then than it is now, and it was never common. Meanwhile, out beyond the Alleghenies, in the theatre the Eastern papers barely covered, the war was quietly being decided, and the president knew it before nearly anyone in his capital. In February of 1862, the unknown Brigadier Ulysses Grant took 2 river forts in Tennessee, Henry on the Tennessee River and Donelson on the Cumberland, demanding of the trapped garrison no terms except unconditional and immediate surrender, words that thrilled a victory starved north and gave the initials of his name a second meaning, and the river highways into the Confederate heartland swung open like unlocked doors. In April, at a steamboat landing called Shiloh, near a log-meeting house in the Tennessee woods, Grant's surprised army was driven nearly into the river on the first day, and, reinforced in the night, took the whole field back on the second, at a cost in 2 days, 23,000 men fallen on the two sides, that exceeded every previous American war added together, and the country recoiled, and the newspapers screamed for Grant's removal, carrying tales of surprise and worse, and the pressure came to the president from every side, and he sat with a friend late one night, heard the whole indictment out, was silent a long while, and then said the sentence that decided more than any battle that year. "I cannot spare this man, he fights." That same spring the Navy did its part, and the President had a hand there too, for he had pushed hard for the strange new ironclad ships, and in March, in the waters off Hampton Roads, the little Union Monitor, looking, as everyone said, like a tin can on a shingle, fought the armoured rebel Virginia to a standstill in the first battle ever waged between iron ships. And every wooden navy on earth became obsolete in an afternoon, and in April the fleet of the old sailor Farragut ran the forts below New Orleans in the dark, and took the Confederacy's greatest city and port without a land battle, so that by midsummer of 1862, while the East knew nothing but McClellan's grand paralysis, the West had given Lincoln the Mississippi's upper and lower reaches, the border states, and the man he would eventually trust with everything. The President absorbed all of it at the telegraph desk, teaching himself the rivers and the railroads from the maps, as he had once taught himself surveying, and his war telegrams from those months, hundreds of them, have a tone all their own in the literature of command, patient, homely, precise, and now and then flashing the old circuit rider wit, as when he wired a general who had reported capturing cows with the question of what he should do with the cows, milk them, or asked another, who forever demanded reinforcements while standing still, whether, since the army was doing nothing. He might borrow it for a while if the general had no immediate use for it. The jokes travelled, as his jokes always had, from the telegraph office through the army and out into the country, and they did a work of state that no proclamation could. For a people trudging through casualty lists will follow a leader who sounds like their uncle a long way further than one who sounds like a monument, and he knew that, had known it since the New Salem store counter. And if the humour was also, as those closest to him understood, the pump handle he worked to keep his own dark waters down, well, a tool that does two jobs at once was always the frontier's favourite kind. Which brings us, softly now, to February of 1862, and the middle sorrow of this life, the one from which those who knew him best dated the deepening of everything in him. That winter both younger boys went down with fever, typhoid almost certainly, carried, in the grim irony of the age, by the very water piped into the President's house, and Tad recovered, and Willie, 11 years old, the gentle, bookish, sweet-tempered one, the boy everyone said was most his father over again, did not. For 2 weeks the President shuttled between the war and the bedside, and on the 20th of February the boy died in the great guest bed of the mansion, and Lincoln walked into his secretary's office and said that his boy was gone. Actually gone. And burst into tears before them all, and twice afterward, on the weekly day of the boy's death, he shut himself away to grieve until the work reached in and took him back. Mary never truly recovered, kept to her room for months, could not bear ever again to enter the room where he died, and the household bent around her breaking as best it could, and the father carried it the way he carried things, inward, and visitors that spring-noted what the photographs from year to year now begin to show anyone who looks, the face carving itself hollow, the eyes going further and further back, the merriest man in Washington becoming, without ever losing the jokes, the saddest face, men said, ever painted by grief on a living person. He had no settled churchly faith. This president had never joined a congregation, had been in his young sceptical years the village freethinker, and yet out of that season of private loss and public slaughter, the letters and papers begin to fill with a wrestling, absolutely his own, with Providence, with the purposes of the Almighty, culminating in a private scrap found after his death in which he reasons, like the lawyer he was, that God could not be for and against the same thing, that in a great contest each party claims to act upon the will of God, and both may be, and one must be, wrong, and that perhaps the purposes of the Almighty were something different from the purposes of either party, a thought he would one day place, polished like a river stone, at the centre of the greatest short speech in the language. But that is ahead of us still, down the dark years away, and there is no hurry at all. His refuge in those years, such as it was, had 2 rooms. One was the telegraph office at the War Department, next door to the White House, where he walked several times a day and often deep into the night. Because the clacking cipher room was the one place the war came to him raw and first, and there, in a quiet corner desk by the window, between dispatches, he found something like peace among the young operators, who adored him, and it was there, in the summer of 1862, borrowing foolscap day after day, locking the pages in the cipher desk drawer each evening, that he slowly wrote out, in secret, the first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. The other room was a cottage on a breezy hilltop 3 miles north of the city, on the grounds of the soldiers' home, where the family fled the Potomac heat each summer, and the president commuted to the war on horseback, alone at first until an August night, when a sniper's bullet or a hunter's stray, he preferred the second theory, took his hat off his head at the gate. After which the cavalry escort was no longer optional, and it was on those hilltop nights, with the wounded from the army hospitals encamped in view and the burial parties working in the soldiers' cemetery just beyond the grove, that the middle of this story quietly turned into its end, because emancipation, the thing itself, ripened there. Understand, gently, what the question looked like from inside that summer. He had come to office pledged, hand on the book, only to contain slavery, not to touch it where it stood, and he was holding the Union together with 4 slave states still inside it, and he believed to his marrow that if he lost Kentucky, he lost the whole game. And the war itself kept forcing the issue up through the floorboards, for wherever the armies marched, enslaved people freed themselves and walked into the Union lines by the thousand, and every general improvised a different answer. And twice when commanders proclaimed emancipation on their own authority, Lincoln revoked it, taking the fury of the abolitionists full in the face, because a proclamation that shattered the border states would free no one and lose the war. And to the great editor Horace Greeley, who assailed him that August to strike at slavery now, he wrote out the coldest and most carefully aimed public letter of his life, that his paramount object in this struggle was to save the Union, and was not either to save or to destroy slavery, that whatever he did about slavery he did because it helped to save the Union. And he closed that letter with a sentence the country barely noticed, and should have, that he intended no modification of his oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. What the country did not know, and Greeley did not know, was that the proclamation was already written, locked in the cipher desk, decided, waiting, because in July he had read it to the cabinet, and Seward had made the one objection that stuck, that issued on the heels of endless defeats it would sound like a shriek of despair, the last measure of an exhausted government, and so the president had put the paper away to wait for a victory, and the summer gave him instead the second humiliation at Bull Run, and the emboldened enemy crossed the Potomac north into Maryland, and the war rose to the worst single day in all American history, the 17th of September, 1862. Along a creek called Antietam, where in 12 hours of fighting near the town of Sharpsburg, more Americans fell than on any other day before or since. And when it was over, the invasion had been turned back south across the river, and it was enough, barely, and 5 days later, on the 22nd of September, the president called the cabinet together, opened the meeting, characteristically, by reading them a chapter from a humorist while the great men fidgeted, and then, laying the book down, told them that he had made a promise to himself, and, he said quietly, to his Maker, that when the rebel army was driven from Maryland, he would issue the proclamation, and that the time for the promise had come, and he read it out, and it went to the country that afternoon, notice to the world that on the 1st day of January next, all persons held as slaves within any state still in rebellion would be then, thenceforward, and forever free. And on that New Year's morning of 1863, after 3 hours of receiving the annual crush of handshakers, he stood at his desk with the engrossed parchment before him and his right hand so swollen and trembling from the reception line that he paused, holding the pen, and said to those around him that if his name ever went into history, it would be for this act, and his whole soul was in it, and that if his hand shook when he signed, all who examined the document hereafter would say he had hesitated, and so he waited, a long moment, flexing his fingers, and then wrote his name slowly and firmly in full. Abraham Lincoln, no hesitation in a single letter of it, and looked up and smiled, and said, "That will do." The proclamation changed the war in its bones. It did not, as the lawyers point out with justice, free anyone on the morning it was signed, for it reached, by its own careful terms, only the territory the government did not yet control, but it turned the Union armies, wherever they now advanced, into a walking edge of freedom, and it flung open the gates of military service. So that by war's end nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors, a great many of them freed men and escaped men, wore the Union blue and turned, in Lincoln's own later reckoning, the balance of the war, and it slammed shut, at a stroke, the door through which Britain and France had been eyeing intervention, for no European government could now stand openly with slavery against. Emancipation, and it transformed at last and forever what the enormous suffering was for. The suffering itself, however, did not pause, and we should not hurry past how dark the road stayed, and for how long. In December of 1862, the Army of the Potomac was flung uphill at entrenchments above Fredericksburg in 14 hopeless assaults, and the President, hearing the numbers, walked his room all night, saying to a friend that if there was a worse place than hell, he was in it, and in the spring at Chancellorsville the same army, better led at last in every rank but the top, was beaten again by half its numbers, and the peace wing of the Northern press bade for negotiation, and the President's own party despaired of him. And through all of it he somehow kept 3 things in motion at once: the army's, the country's will, and his own crushed spirit, and of the 3, those closest to him thought the third was the heaviest lift. What kept him standing, as far as those who watched can testify, was work, and mercy, and the stories. The work was endless, and he did it endlessly. The mercy became legend even while he lived. The corridors and stairways of the White House packed every morning with petitioners, mothers, widows, contract seekers, cranks, and he saw them, hour upon hour, over his secretary's furious objections, calling the appointments his public opinion baths, and the court-martial death warrants for sleeping sentries and homesick deserters came to his desk, in stacks, and he searched each one for any handle, any extenuation, a boy's age, a mother's letter, calling the executions of frightened farm boys butchery, and telegraphing suspensions to the front until his generals complained that the President was ruining army discipline one pardon at a time. A complaint he bore, it must be said, with magnificent serenity. And the stories, always the stories, the old prairie medicine, deployed now not to win juries but to survive the days, and when a delegation of the grave and censorious once demanded to know how he could jest at such an hour, he answered, with the tears standing suddenly in his eyes, that he laughed because he must not cry, that were it not for his stories he should die. And they went out subdued, having glimpsed the machinery. Then came the high summer of 1863, the hinge of the whole war, when in the same single week of July the 2 great victories arrived together, in the east at a Pennsylvania crossroads town called Gettysburg, where for 3 days the invading army broke itself against the Union lines on the ridges, 40,000 men falling between the 2 sides before the grey columns turned back south in the rain for the last time, and in the west at Vicksburg, the fortress on the Mississippi bluffs, which surrendered to Grant on the 4th of July itself, so that the great river ran, in Lincoln's phrase, unvexed to the sea, and the Confederacy was cut in 2, and the President, ringing the news home, allowed himself, for once, something like joy. That November he was invited, almost as an afterthought, to help dedicate the new soldiers' cemetery on the Gettysburg battlefield. The featured orator being the celebrated Everett, who spoke in the fashion of the age for 2 hours, magnificently by all accounts, and then the president rose, unfolded 2 small pages, and in his high carrying voice, in something under 3 minutes, delivered 272 words, and sat down before much of the crowd realized he had begun. 77 years ago it opened, reaching back past the Constitution to the Declaration, to the proposition that all men are created equal, and it asked whether any nation so conceived could long endure, and it said that the world would little note nor long remember what was said there, which is the single sentence in all his works in which he was ever entirely wrong. And it resolved that these dead shall not have died in vain, that the nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Everett wrote to him the next day that he should be glad if he had come as near the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as the president had in 2 minutes. And he was right, for in those few sentences the war had been given its meaning permanently, and the American experiment its creed, and schoolchildren have stood up and spoken it from memory, in every accent the country owns, from that day to this one. In the spring of 1864 the president finally solved his longest problem, and the solution was the quiet man from the West. He brought Grant east, made him general-in-chief of all the armies, and found in him at last the thing he had begged of general after general, a man who took the war's terrible arithmetic on himself and did not look back over his shoulder at Washington. And the president told him simply that the particulars of his plans he neither knew nor sought to know, and Grant, for his part, marked with wonder that Lincoln was the one man in Washington who did not try to fight the campaign for him, and the two of them, the storyteller and the silent one, settled into a mutual trust that neither ever broke. What Grant then did was grip the enemy and not let go, all fronts at once, exactly the strategy the president had been urging on deaf professionals for 3 years. And what it cost through that terrible early summer, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, was casualty lists beyond anything the country had yet imagined. 60,000 men in 6 weeks. And the North reeled, and the peace press called the president a butcher, and gold soared and enlistments sagged, and the war reached its darkest political hour precisely as the president himself came up. For re-election, an election which, let it be said slowly here in the dark, because it may be the most remarkable single fact in this whole long story, was held, on schedule, in the middle of a civil war, ballots and stump speeches and a free hostile press and all, because Lincoln insisted that if the rebellion could force the postponement of a free election, then the rebellion had already won the argument about self-government, whatever the armies did. That August he himself expected to lose, wrote out a private memorandum saying so, that it seemed exceedingly probable the administration would not be re-elected, and that it would then be his duty to cooperate with the president-elect to save the Union before the inauguration. Folded it. Had every cabinet member sign the outside unread, and put it away. Which is the strangest and steadiest act of constitutional faith in the American record, a president pre-committing himself, sight unseen, to his own defeat. And then, in the first days of September, the telegraph brought the thunderclap from Georgia, Atlanta is ours, and fairly won. Sherman had taken the gate city of the Deep South, and the whole political sky changed colour in an afternoon, and in November the soldiers themselves voted in their camps, by huge majorities for the man who could not stop pardoning them. And Abraham Lincoln was re-elected with 55% of the vote, carrying every state remaining in the Union but 3. And he told a crowd of serenaders that night, with no triumph in it at all, that the election had demonstrated to the world that a people's government could sustain a national election in the midst of a great civil war, and that this, more than any personal result, was the victory. Before we ride the last year home, let us gather up, like gleanings after a harvest, a few of the smaller true things from those wartime seasons, the ones that do not fit the battle maps, but that carry the man better than the maps do. There was the July of 1863, when the new draft law touched off 4 days of rioting in New York City, mobs burning draft offices and lynching black citizens in the streets, until regiments marched straight from the Gettysburg Field to put it down, and the president, urged to cancel the draft, would not, and urged to punish the city, would not do that either, but simply set the wheel turning again, because the armies had to be filled, and mercy and firmness were never opposites in him, but the two hands of the same workman. There was the autumn proclamation of that same year, urged on him for decades' worth of Octobers by a persistent magazine editor named Sarah Josepha Hale, by which he set apart the last Thursday of November as a national day of thanksgiving, in the middle of the bloodiest war the hemisphere had known, asking the whole people to remember, in the same breath, the widows and orphans and the fruitful fields, and Americans have sat down to that table on that Thursday every year since, most of them never knowing at whose invitation. There was the White House turkey, sent for the Christmas table of 1863, which Tad named Jack and tamed and led about the grounds on a string, and when the cook's intentions became clear the boy burst into a cabinet meeting sobbing, and the President of the United States, interrupting the war, wrote out on a card a formal reprieve for the bird, and thereby founded, in the accidental way the best traditions are founded, the pardoning of turkeys by presidents, which continues to this day, and which is, you will agree, a better use of executive clemency than most. There were the letters, because in an age when a president still wrote his own, the pen kept doing quiet work the speeches could not. To a grieving Boston mother reported to have lost 5 sons, he wrote of the solemn pride that must be hers to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom, and the report was wrong, as reports in wartime are, and the letter is carved in bronze anyway, because the country decided the words were true even if the count was not. To a young officer's father he wrote that in this sad world of ours, sorrow comes to all, and to the young it comes with bitterest agony, because it takes them unawares, and that the older ones have learned to expect it, and he was writing, as his readers could feel, from far inside the subject. And to a general about to fight he once confessed in writing a thing no ruler confesses, that the general had been right and he had been wrong, and signed it, and sent it, and if you are keeping a list tonight of the habits of greatness, put that one near the top. The ability to say so plainly on paper, when you were the one with the power and the other man had none. There was even, in the deep summer of 1864, a morning when the war walked up to the president personally, for the rebel General Early, in the last bold throw of the Confederacy, drove a raiding army to the very earthworks of Washington itself, to a bastion called Fort Stevens 5 miles from the White House, and the president rode out to sea, and stood up on the parapet in his tall hat, the most recognizable silhouette in North America, gawking at the skirmish lines like the volunteer captain of 1832 while bullets clipped the sandbags, until a young officer beside him, not recognizing or not caring whom he addressed, roared at the fool to get down before he got shot. And the fool got down, amused and obedient, and the young officer, who would sit one day on the Supreme Court, dined out on the story for 60 years. And it remains the only time in the country's history that a sitting president has stood under enemy fire, a record everyone since has been content to leave with him. And running under all of it, that last full year, was the weariness, which he no longer troubled to hide from those close in. He told a friend that the tired spot was inside, and out of reach, and the photographs from the spring of 1865, set beside the ones from Springfield 5 years earlier, show what the office had taken: the face fallen in, the eye sockets gone to caves, a man of 56 wearing the mask of 70, and yet the visitors of those same weeks record the stories still coming. The laugh still sudden and whole-bodied, the endless line of petitioners still admitted, still heard, still, more often than not, sent away with the paper they came for. Because the machinery of kindness, whatever it cost the machine, was never once allowed to stop, and now, with the lamps of the second inauguration behind us and the 9th of April ahead, you know everything you need to know about the man in the tall hat, and the rest of the story you already feel coming, the way you feel weather, and we will walk through it together, slowly, and it will be sad, and it will be all right, because it is old sorrow now, folded soft by a century and a half, and because the man himself, of all men, knew how to walk through sorrow at exactly this pace. One quiet step at a time, without hurry and without fear. With the election won, he turned at once to the work he cared most about finishing, and it was not military. The Emancipation Proclamation had been a war measure, resting on his war powers, and he knew as well as any lawyer alive that when the war ended the courts might pick it apart, and so freedom, to be safe, had to be sewn permanently into the Constitution itself. And through the winter of 1864 and 65 the President threw everything he had, patronage, persuasion, and methods his managers were tactfully vague about ever afterward. Behind the 13th Amendment, the one abolishing slavery everywhere in the United States forever, and on the 31st of January, 1865, the House of Representatives passed it by exactly the required 2/3, with 3 votes to spare, and the chamber went mad, congressmen weeping and embracing on the floor the gallery, where black citizens sat watching for the first time in the Capitol's history, thundering, and the guns firing salutes across Washington and Lincoln. Signing his name to the document, though no signature was required, called it a king's cure for all the evils. And if you want a single day to mark how far the boy from the fence rail on the Cumberland Road had carried the argument, that day will do. 5 weeks later came the 4th of March and the second inauguration, and the shortest and strangest and greatest speech any American president has ever delivered from the Capitol steps. It had rained for days, and the crowd stood in a sea of mud, and as he rose to speak, the witnesses all recorded it, the sun broke through for the first time and flooded the portico, and the address he read was 701 words long, and it promised nothing. Boasted of nothing, and comforted almost no one, for instead of victory it offered the whole grieving country, north and south alike, a terrible and level meditation. That both sides read the same Bible and prayed to the same God, and that the prayers of both could not be answered, and that if God now willed that the war continue until every drop of blood drawn with the lash was paid by another, drawn with the sword, then still it must be said, as was said 3,000 years ago, that the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, and then, with the war's end plainly in sight, and every temptation on earth to promise punishment, he closed instead with the words that are carved now in marble above his statue, with malice toward none, with charity for all. With firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. He thought it. He wrote to a friend, perhaps the best thing he had ever produced, though he expected it was not immediately popular. For men are not flattered, he said, by being shown that there has been a difference of purpose between the Almighty and them, and he was right on both counts, and among the thousands in the mud that morning, we now know. Standing on the very steps above the President with a clear line of sight was a famous young actor with a pistol in his future, but the day knew nothing of that, and the sun stayed out. The end of the war came now in great strides. At the close of March, the President went down to the front himself at Grant's invitation and lived 2 weeks aboard a steamer at the supply base on the James, visiting the lines, riding among the burial parties and the field hospitals with that hollowed face. And it was there that word came, on the 2nd of April, that the enemy lines had broken at last, that Richmond was falling, and on the 4th of April, 1865, occurred one of the most extraordinary scenes in the whole national story. The President of the United States walking through the burning surrendered capital of the Confederacy, up from the river landing hand in hand with little Tad, whose 12th birthday it happened to be, escorted by a handful of sailors, and the streets filling around him, block by block, with freed men and women, thousands upon thousands, pressing in to touch him, kneeling to him until he asked them, distressed not to kneel, telling them they must kneel to God only and thank him for their freedom, and he walked on through that weeping crowd to the abandoned mansion of the Confederate president, and sat down for a moment, dusty and silent in the other man's chair, and asked, of all the conqueror's demands available to him, for a glass of water. 5 days later, on the 9th of April, in the parlour of a farmhouse at a crossroads called Appomattox Courthouse, the principal rebel army laid down its arms on terms of a generosity that astonished the world. Officers to keep their sidearms, every man to keep his horse for the spring ploughing, rations issued to the starving ranks from the wagons of the army they had fought for 4 years. Terms that were Grant's on the page and Lincoln's in the marrow, for the president had told his commanders plainly on the river steamer, "Let them up easy, I want no hangings. Let them go home to their farms and their shops." And when the news of the surrender reached Washington, the city simply dissolved. Cannon firing, church bells, total strangers embracing in the streets. An enormous crowd surging to the White House calling for the president, and he came to the window and, in perhaps the most Lincoln gesture on record, asked the band to play Dixie, the song of the other side, which he said he had always loved, and which the Attorney General, he joked, had now ruled to be lawful Union property, fairly captured, and the band played it. And the crowd laughed and wept at once, and that was how the man celebrated the winning of the great war of his age, with a borrowed song and a lawyer's joke, and no malice anywhere in him at all. On the evening of the 11th of April he spoke from that same window to another vast crowd on the drenched lawn, and it was not the speech they had come for. No crowing, no fireworks in it, but a sober, careful working man's argument about Reconstruction, about how the seceded states were to be brought back into their practical relation with the Union, and in the course of it, gently, almost in passing, he said a thing no American president had ever said in public, that he himself would prefer that the elective franchise, the vote, be conferred on the black man, at least on the very intelligent, and on those who had served our cause as soldiers. And down in the crowd, under the dripping trees, the young actor from the inauguration steps turned to a companion and swore that this meant citizenship for black men, and that it was the last speech the man would ever make, and, God willing, he would put him through. And for once in his strutting life, the actor kept a promise exactly. And so we come, quietly, as the night itself comes, to the 14th of April 1865, which was Good Friday, and which was, those around him agreed, one of the happiest days anyone had seen him have in 4 years. The terrible weight was visibly lifting. He told his cabinet that morning, Grant sitting in with them, that he expected good news from the last armies still in the field, because he had, the night before, the strange recurring dream that had come to him, he said, on the eve of nearly every great event of the war, of being aboard some singular, indescribable vessel, moving with great rapidity toward an indefinite shore. And the cabinet, hearing him tell it, did not know what to make of it, and neither, he admitted cheerfully, did he. That afternoon he took Mary for a long carriage ride, just the two of them, out toward the Navy Yard in the spring air, and she remarked that he almost startled her with his cheerfulness, and he told her that they must both be more cheerful now, that between the war and the loss of Willie they had both been very miserable, and he talked leaning back about the years after the presidency, about maybe taking her to Europe, to Jerusalem, about coming home in the end to Springfield and the old law office, and living out their days in peace among the people who knew them first. And it is permitted, I think, here in the dark, to leave them there in that carriage a little longer than history did, two middle-aged people from Illinois, holding hands in the April sunshine, making plans. In the evening they went to the theatre. It was a light comedy at Ford's, a few blocks from the White House, a play he had seen before and liked well enough, and the general and his wife had begged off. And so another young couple sat with them in the flag draped up a box, and the audience rose and cheered as the president came in, and the orchestra played, and he settled into the rocking chair the management kept for him, with Mary beside him with her hand in his, and the play ran on pleasantly through its silliness, and a little after 10 o'clock, in the middle of the third act, on one of the best laugh lines of the night, with the whole house roaring, the young actor, who knew the play to the syllable and had timed his moment to the laugh, stepped through the unguarded door at the back of the box, and what happened then happened in an instant. and the president never knew it, never heard it, never felt it. The doctors were always clear on that one mercy. He was laughing, and then he was simply gone from us, though his great strong body, which had split the rails and carried the axe, and outlasted every hardship the frontier could devise, breathed on, unconscious, through the whole of that endless night, in a too-short bed in a boarding-house across the street, laid diagonally because no bed in the house could hold his length, with the surgeons helpless around him and Mary sobbing in the parlour, and the cabinet crowding the little room, and the spring rain beginning outside, and at 7:22 the next morning, as the grey light came up over Washington, the breathing stopped, and the Secretary of War, Iron Stanton, who had once called him the original guerrilla in the McClellan days, and had come to love him beyond any man living, stood at the foot of the bed with the tears running into his beard, and spoke the sentence the country has kept ever since: "Now he belongs to the ages." What followed? For 20 days, nothing in American history has ever resembled. The war's ending and the murder had landed on the country within a single week, joy and horror riding the same telegraph wires, and the nation, which had been about to celebrate, instead hung itself in black. Every depot, every farmhouse porch, every shop window from Maine to the Mississippi, and the funeral train, 9 cars draped in mourning, carrying the president and, beside him, the small disinterred coffin of Willie, going home to be buried with his father, set out from Washington to retrace, almost mile for mile in reverse, the route the president-elect had travelled east 4 years before. 1,700 miles through Baltimore and Philadelphia, and New York and Cleveland and Chicago, and the country came out to stand along the rails. All of it. 7 million people by the estimates, farmers kneeling in their fields as the train passed, bonfires burning all night at the crossings, choirs singing at 2 a.m. in the depot towns, the lines to pass the open coffin in the great cities running 6 abreast for a mile. And in the wet fields along the tracks, over and over, witnesses recorded the same sight. Old soldiers, some of them missing an arm or a leg, standing at attention in their worn uniforms, weeping without a sound as the black train went slowly by, and among the mourners in those crowds, let it never be left out of the telling, were hundreds of thousands of black Americans, free now by the pen of the man on the train, who stood in the rain with their children lifted on their shoulders, so that the children, grown old, could say to their own grandchildren, "I saw him pass." And on the 4th of May, 1865, in the green new cemetery of Oak Ridge on the edge of Springfield, among the prairie oaks, with the neighbours of his young manhood standing in the spring grass, Abraham Lincoln was laid at last into the ground of Illinois, the ground he had ploughed and surveyed and ridden over half his life, and the long journey that had begun 56 winters before on a corn-husk bed in a dirt-floored Kentucky cabin, was over. And the other journey, the one that has no terminus, the journey through the memory of the world, had just begun. And what a journey it has been, that second one. Sleep is close for you now, I hope, so let us take the last few steps of tonight slowly, and softly, the way you walk the last steps to a door you do not want to slam. The people of his own story went on without him, each carrying a piece. Mary wandered, in grief that the age had no help for, through hotels and spas and sorrows, and outlived Tad too, who died at 18. And of the 4 boys only Robert lived out a full span, on into the age of automobiles and moving pictures, dying an old man in 1926, with a photograph of his father on the wall. Sarah Bush Lincoln, the stepmother who had defended the boy in his books, lived on in her Illinois farmhouse until 1869, and to the end when visitors asked. She would tell them that Abe was the best boy she ever saw, and that he never gave her a cross word or look in his life, which is, when you weigh all the monuments, perhaps still the finest one. The words themselves scattered outward like seed off the prairie wind, and simply never stopped growing. The Gettysburg Address went into the school books, and then into the marble, and then into the founding documents of other nations, and government of the people, by the people, for the people has been translated into nearly every language on the earth, and spoken aloud by people struggling toward their own freedom on every continent, most of whom could not find Springfield on a map, and do not need to. In 1922, on the drained marshland at the end of the Long Green Mall in Washington, they dedicated the memorial, a white Greek temple holding a seated colossus of the man, 19 feet of Georgia marble, gazing east up the reflecting pool toward the Capitol he preserved, with the Gettysburg Address carved into one wall and the second inaugural into the other, and Robert, white-haired, was there in the front row to see it, and in the 100 years since, that temple has become the country's secular altar, the place the nation walks to at night when it needs to talk to its better self. And on the steps of it, in 1963, a preacher from Georgia stood in the symbolic shadow of the great emancipator, as he said in his opening breath, and told the country about a dream he had, which tells you the story we have been following all night did not end at Oak Ridge Cemetery, and has not ended yet. His face went onto the penny and the $5 bill, the humblest money, the money of newsboys and lemonade stands, which he of all presidents would have found the right address, and onto a mountainside in the Dakota Hills beside Washington, Jefferson, and Roosevelt, and into more books than have been written about any other human being save one or two founders of religions. And still, every year the historians are asked to rank the presidents, and still, every year, with a regularity that has itself become a little American tradition, the rail splitter comes out at the top of the list, and the reason, I think, is not the war won or even the enslaved freed, mighty as those are. The reason is the shape of the whole life, the thing you have been listening to tonight, the fact that the most powerful man of his century was made, visibly, out of the least promising materials the country had, out of dirt floors and borrowed books and buried children and failed stores and lost elections, and that the power, when at last it came to him whole, found nothing in him that wanted to punish anybody with it, and there is something in that shape, the long, sad kind, strong shape of that life, that people in every generation and every country have looked at and been steadied by, the way you are steadied by a big tree that has clearly come through many winters. So let him go now gently, the way the crowds along the railroad let the slow train go, and let the whole long story settle down over you like a quilt, the cabin and the creek, the firelight on the pages, the flatboat swinging out into the great brown river, the little village on the bluff that took in a piece of floating driftwood and made a man of it, the prairie dusk and the slow horse and the tall hat full of letters, the parlour wedding on the rainy November night, the White House with the goats in the East Room and the laughter in the halls, the lamplit telegraph office with the pen scratching toward freedom, the 2 minutes at Gettysburg, the sun breaking through on the Capitol steps, malice toward none, charity for all, the April crowds, the borrowed song, and the long black train moving west through the standing wheat, while the whole country took its hat off in the rain. He believed and said, in the last winter of his life, that the world was not so bad as it looked from inside a hard year, that the occasion was piled high with difficulty, but that we must rise with it, that we must think anew and act anew, and then we shall save our country. And he was speaking to a Congress at war. But he might as well tonight be speaking quietly to you, at the end of whatever your own long day has held, because the deepest thing his story has ever offered anybody is simply this, that no beginning is too small, no failure final, no sorrow wasted, and that a person can carry an almost unbearable weight a very long way if they will only keep walking slowly and stay kind while they do it. Now the lamp is very low, and the story is told, all of it, beginning to end and a little past the end, and there is nothing more you need to hold on to tonight. If you are still awake, even just barely, there is another long life waiting for you on the screen, another quiet biography told slowly in the dark, ready whenever you want it, tonight or tomorrow or some far-off sleepless night next winter. And if these stories are helping you find your way down into rest, you might leave a like, or subscribe, but only, truly, if you have enjoyed the listening. And if you have not already, you can still whisper your town and your local time into the comments, so that some other tired soul scrolling in the dark tonight will see it and know they are not the only one awake in this world, because they are not, and neither are you, and there is a real comfort in that. All these strangers, all around the sleeping earth, keeping each other quiet company, without ever meeting at all. Let your breathing go slow now, slower than the river, slower than the train. Let the day be over, fully over, every unfinished thing in it forgiven until morning. Let your shoulders come down that one last inch they have been saving, and let your hands rest open, and let the dark be soft around you, the way the dark was soft around a boy on a bearskin bed a very long time ago, with the fire settled to embers and the great forest holding the little cabin like a hand. History does not disappear, you know. It just becomes the ground beneath our feet, and it is holding you up right now, steady and patient, and it will hold you all night long. Rest now. You have listened long and well, and the story is safely told, and the night is wide and kind, and sleep is very near. Close your eyes. Good night, and sleep deeply, and sweet, sweet dreams.